guys, welcome back to another video. Right after Drift Week 2, I asked a question on Instagram if anybody wanted to do a Q&A video, like people could send me questions by DM or email or directly in the post. Some people did that. I got a bunch of emails. Sadly, a lot of them are also the exact same questions, so I tried to kind of avoid an overlap in that. So I choose a bunch of questions out of those to answer. If you have any more questions, you can always send a DM on YouTube or Instagram or whatever. Send an email address right over here. We like email the best. And I'll try to answer them for you guys. And leave me some comments what you feel or what your response to that question would be, because it's like I really enjoy reading it. And as you know, I try to answer everything that's being posted on my socials. So I really appreciate that. So the first question I got from Rick from the Netherlands. He asked me, which chassis surprised you the most and which chassis would you still like to try? And I presume that that's about drift cars, of course. The chassis that really surprised me a lot on Drift Week was Brian's car, like the clown shoe, because it's such a rare car to drift. It may be very similar to an E30. But like the way you sit in, where you sit in the car and everything, that's a lot different from an E30. And Brian doesn't run a lot of horsepower, but that car could hang with almost any car on Drift Week 2 and 3, which also included a lot of the JZ guys like Fielding with that JZ, Brandon Wicknick. A lot of those guys ran way more power than Brian, and he could hang with it. So that's very, very good. I think that's one of those chassis that you want to look into, because I think the weight balance of it is pretty good. And I've kind of always discarded the E30 cars or the E30 rear end cars, like the rear axle cars, for professional drifting because of the rear axle, because they have a camber gain. So when the car, the suspension compresses, then the wheels gain camber. There are some solutions for that. I already put that solution in one of my E30s, I don't know how long ago, maybe 12 or 13 years ago. We already did that. We made a lot of those rear axles for clients, but for some reason I never really, put one and two together, like, hey, I want to build a professional pro car E30 for drifting. Although it was the very first car I ever drifted with was an E30, or like took to a track in order to drift. Of course, I drifted other cars, like without drifting being a sport, but when drifting became a sport, I think this was, for me, the first time was 2003, 2004. And E30 was the first car that I purposely took to a place to drift, which was very, very good solution for drifting. So Brian's clown shoe really surprised me the most. Chassis that I really want to try, that's really funny, because Kurt Calkins, my friend from Oregon, has this Chevelle, which is mounted on like a regional NASCAR style chassis. So it's like not a NASCAR vehicle, but it's like a lower class or different class, like more of a regional or national or like state series, or I don't know. There's so many different NASCAR and stock car types of racing going on that I'm not sure which class that car is from, but it's basically a full tube frame Chevrolet small block side shift gearbox. So that probably sounds familiar for people who know my E46 Pro car, which is side shift G-force with a Chevrolet small block. And I'm very, very impressed with how he built that car, because it has such a huge, we can pull it up in the screen over here. It's a super cool car. Like, the presence of that car is very nice because it's very sleek, and he got a lot out of the door. The door sills are gone, so the lowest point is like the lowest point of the door. Super cool car, super cool guy, of course. Became a good friend of mine, and he actually let me drive that car at Park, which was insane. The video, we're still doing that, so that there's still two or three videos left on Drift Week. We're still making that. That car, like, I really wanted to try that, and didn't want to ask. I'll never ask somebody, can I drive your car? I'm never going to do that. But people come to me and they say, like, hey, would you like to drive my car? For setup purposes, of course, we do a lot of YSWAP and stuff. So people say, like, hey, can you drive my car? See what you think about the shocks or the alignment or whatever. But I'm always very, very, very careful with it. And maybe that's why people trust me with their cars. And I was at park, and Kurt was at park with the Chevelle because he had done Drift Week with the SC that he bought off of Aaron. In retrospect, probably was a good idea because the Chevelle is pretty crude. It has no heat or whatever. But he took it to park, and I was looking at the car and I was like, wow, I love this thing so much. I couldn't wait to see this in real life. I'd only seen it on Facebook. And then he said like, hey, would you like to take it for a spin? And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And it was fantastic. Like the seating position is very far back, like on the Z3. You're very close to the rear axle. So I was kind of expecting like, hey, maybe it feels weird. The car had very little lock. It had maybe the same steering angle of a standard car, but it was very, very, very good. Like it felt really good to drive. Of course, I like the sound, I like the behavior of the small block, and I was really glad that Kurt let me drive that car. The steering wheel was a little big for me, so I had to like shuffle it. I couldn't turn keep my hands on the wheel when I was turning it because it would hit my knees. But it was such a fantastic experience, and that car has so much presence in real life. It's even much cooler than on pictures. So thanks for that question, Rick. I hope I answered it. Peter from UK, he spelled it Petre, so Peter, better. Maybe it's somebody from Scandinavia who moved to the UK, but he has the question why an E46 M3 for Drift Week, and that's actually, I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on that. I build cars back home and I do quite a lot of work on them when I build a car, so we completely strip it and everything. There's no way I was going to be able to do that in the USA. Especially with the whole current COVID situation where it wasn't easy for me to travel. So I had to get a car that was like almost correct from the factory, an E46 M3. For the Drift Week tracks that we had on Drift Week 2, it seemed to be a very good choice. It's not super powerful, it's maybe one of the least powerful cars around on Drift Week 2. Drift Week 3 we had a couple of standard 325 E36s from the boys in California. Drew and Lucas, but on Drift Week 2 I was in the lowest, like 5 cars with the lowest horsepower that were competing, but it has a very good chassis, so the gearbox, the transmission ratios, the rear end ratios, and the engine, like the reach of the revs, like the sweet spot, that goes very, very well together, and that's often very overlooked. So if you have a 600 horsepower 2JZ and you pair it with the wrong gearbox and you pair it with the wrong rear axle, you're kind of neutering it, so it's not going to do what you want it to do. And the E46 M3 is very well balanced, very well put together with the revs and the gear ratios and stuff. So Chelsea knew that, of course. So we were talking. Chelsea kind of said like, "Hey, you should do Drift Week." When I asked what a cool event was in America, and we kind of started like talking back and forth. Like, hey, what should we do? Chelsea had his TI, of course. Said like, hey, you can get my TI. And I was like, yeah, that's cool, but I'm like more an E46 guy. I drift my pro car E46 back home, and everybody knows like the TI has the same rear axle as an E30. So I was like, also like, yeah, that rear axle is not really to my liking, although Chelsea does miracles with that car. It's very, very fast. But back then, like on paper, I was like, hey, I want something that overlaps with my pro car. Also parts wise, obviously Wisefab Field sponsor me, so I wanted to have the same parts. So if whatever the future holds, I have a huge amount of E46 parts back home, so I could ship a lot of parts to America or something. So that's kind of how we thought of that. And then Chelsea found me, he looked at a couple cars and he found a fantastic one in Washington. He picked it up on his way to FD Seattle. So the first picture I saw of that car was in the pit lane at RTR, at the Mustang team of that car, standing in the Formula Drift Seattle pit lane, which was of course super cool. I thank Chelsea a million times for this, also on his channel, but it was such a fantastic job of him sourcing that car. It was so solid that we almost felt bad turning it into a drift car, but it turned out really, really well. Like the problems I had with the car was a Vanos oil line, so the hard line that goes to the front of the Vanos, the front of the engine, that failed in Alabama. Thanks for Chase Base for fixing that for me. I had the pothole thing, but that was not the car's fault in Florida. And that's basically it. Drift Week 3, we had a problem with the plastic fan, which I had never experienced before. The plastic fan, a blade came off, it went in the radiator broke. We never see that in Europe much, maybe in America because it's much hotter, the stuff gets more brittle, the plastic, and you're constantly in high RPM, of course. So that broke, it broke the radiator. So that's a little unfortunate. So I had to fix the radiator. Thank God Duarte Drift HQ carried one with him, so we fixed that. And in Monroe, the track was very easy. It was almost full throttle the whole way. On the entry was maybe not full throttle, or the first transition, but the rest of it was completely full throttle with the M3, which was nice because most of the other Drift Week tracks were kind of tight, kind of technical. So I was like, hey, I'm finally gonna turn up the grip on the car, because with the field suspension, it makes so much grip that I was driving the entirety of Drift Week 2 and most of Drift Week 3 with the least grip setting on the field suspension. And I had the Kendas on Drift Week 2, the Felinos on Drift Week 3, and they were on higher than 40 psi like all the time. Like I remember when I was in Arizona for the very first time and I drove that car and I was like, hey, those tires, what do I do? And guys like Fielding and Aaron said to me like, hey, you need to put 40 or 50 psi in the tires. That's how they perform best and last the longest, which for me was bizarre. Like I had never put more than 30 psi in any tire. So that was very, very funny, but it worked very well. Both the Kendas and the Felinos lasted quite long. And that's like really, really funny. But in Monroe, I was like, hey, this track is so wide and so big. It's Formula Drift track. It's a huge sweeper. So I was like, hey, we can finally turn up the grip on this, you know. And then I did that, and then the center support bearing of the prop, we call it prop shaft. Americans may call it drive shaft, but like the connection between the transmission and the differential, the center bearing for that broke. At first I thought it was wheel hop, but then it turned out to be that center support bearing, and we changed it out, and that was the other problem that we had with the car. So if you told me that that was going to be all the problems I was ever going to get with that car on Drift Week 2 and 3, I would obviously have done it. So super happy with how the M3 performs. So thanks for that question, Petter. As you can tell, I'm not very good at keeping things short. Then we have a question from Charles from the USA. And Charles, by email, he said, do you like USA drifting and cars better, or European Union, EU cars, Europe cars? I have to say that I really like the fact that the Americans also style the cars much more elaborate. So when we went to Villains, all these guys had these huge stance wheels with huge lips, super cool graphics. Like everybody had like these, I think that's a really American thing. Correct me if I'm wrong, maybe it came from another culture, but these lowrider style special painted roofs, which is amazing. Like I really, really love that. And I really like that the looks of the Americans obviously have the super utilitarian cars, the really pro spec cars, but they also have even the pro spec cars like Ryan Littrell's car, a bunch of those other cars. They look super, super good with nice graphics, nice wheels, nice fitment. I really like that. In America, in Europe, there's not so many guys who do that. A couple in the UK. I also talked about this with the very first Lone Star Drift interview that I did with Aaron. But that's typically American in my book. A lot of the grassroots guys, they absolutely care about the fitment of the wheels and like the graphics, and they get super cool body kits and stuff. I really like that. What I like about European Union is that guys will be a little more practical. So they will have the weirdest solutions for everything, so just that they can drive. You know, when I was in Estonia, visiting my friend Harry, I saw a lot of the cars. Some cars were super nice, super well built, but there were also guys that just had put a V8 in an E36, which really didn't fit. So there was like a gap, like maybe 10 inches between the cylinder heads and the bulkhead, because they didn't change the sump. They just put a BMW M60 in it and ran it that way, which would be a completely wrong weight distribution and everything, because as you know, the M60 with the front sump doesn't fit the E36, but those guys just put it in and just put it in the way it fits, and they drove with it the whole day and all the time, and maybe put a turbo on it, stuck on open motor, and it obviously blows after a couple of events. So I really like the European spirit. The Americans may have it as well, but I've seen it a little bit more in Europe, and that's something that I really, really like, that some guys are really thinking of these out-of-the-box solutions. So that's what I like. And the drifting, I think it's very comparable. Just the tracks in Europe, like the level of driving is comparable. The tracks in Europe are much shorter than the tracks in America. So that's part one. Stay tuned for part two.